Hello, and welcome to this preliminary lecture called Stories About the Past. There's two parts. This is part one. I'd like all my students in all my history classes to start with this lecture. I think it's very important and important to know at the beginning. And the reason is because I've been teaching for over 20 years now. I've had thousands of students in my classes from all over the world. And one thing that I've noticed is that many students come with some serious misconceptions about what history is. And I think those misconceptions often hurt students' grades, to be honest. So I'd like to try to correct those right from the very beginning. The biggest misconception is that I think a lot of students come to my classes thinking of history as a list of irrefutable facts that everybody agrees on. So it's just a list of facts, things that happened in the past, and it's easy because everybody agrees upon them and they're certain, and history classes and historical discipline is about memorizing those facts. Because people have this misconception, they see history as this long list of dates and names and facts that you memorize. Because they see it that way, they misuse it. People see it as this easily available treasury of information that when you're in a political discussion or argument with somebody, you can just bring up historical facts to win your argument. And people often refer to problems in history in this way, with this kind of self-confident arrogance that it's all agreed upon and it's all certain, and you can just use those facts easily to win a political debate or argument. And I think that's a really incorrect way of seeing history. Maybe to give a quick example, in our public discourse today, you see the word fascism all the time. Well, that's something that happened in history. People love to throw around the word fascism and call people fascists. And they think that it's really clear what that is and what that means. And so I've noticed as a history professor that those people that are the most religiously confident in the certainty of historical facts like fascism, and use that to win the political argument of the moment, usually those people, when I quiz them a little bit, it turns out they don't really know much about the details of fascism in the interwar period. I could elaborate on that, but just briefly, people think of fascism, they automatically think of the Nazis. They don't realize that almost every European country had, in some cases, a fascist party that took over, in other cases, a fascist popular party that was fascist, or in other cases, parties that weren't really fascist, but acted like fascists, and there was sympathy. And so it's all across Europe, and it's complicated. But most people aren't aware of those details. They have a very simplistic idea in their head of what fascism is, and they think it's useful to use it as in name calling in some modern political discussion, but they really don't know much about it. And so that's just one example of how the people who seem the most certain about the facts of history and want to use it in the most emotional way and are the most kind of religious about it are often the people who know really the least about the details. And then there's one other misconception, and it goes along with this idea of just the facts. People seem to think that there's good historians and they write objective history. There's good objective history, and then there's these bad historians. I've been accused of this, who write revisionist history. It's like history was set, it was all fixed. And then these bad revisionist historians changed history, like that's some kind of crime. And so there's the good historians who are objective, and their history is the true history. And then there's those bad historians who want to change history. I'll get to that more at the end of my lecture, but I would argue that all history is revisionist history. There's no other thing. When you look at history as a list of agreed upon facts, you reduce it to something like Christian fundamentalism. It's just a matter of reciting the facts. Well, why would you need experts then? You wouldn't. You could democratize all of historical knowledge and everybody could learn it, and there would be no reason for discussion. But the fact is, there is still plenty of research going on in history. There are lots of questions that aren't answered, and there are experts that agree with themselves very strong among themselves about what you might think are very basic issues, like the nature of fascism, for example. Anyway, so my aim today is to disabuse you of this notion that history is just an agreed upon list of facts. And I think the best way to do that is to just walk you through what historians do. And I think when you actually understand how the historical discipline works, you'll have to give up some of your ideas about history as just a bunch of facts that you memorize and write down and learn. Think of another discipline. Think of physics. We all know that we don't understand what physicists do. And we don't try to pretend. We just know we don't know what the physicists do. History, fortunately, for me at least, is not as hard as physics. So that's good. But do you really know what historians really do? Now, it's not as complicated as physics. But do you really know all the complexities of that discipline? And how do you get those so-called facts in the textbook? Where do they come from? And so I want to make the world a little more complicated by sharing my discipline with you. I am a historian who I have worked in archives with original sources and published my findings, and I've taught history for, like I said, a long time now. So I'd like to introduce you a little bit to my discipline and maybe make things a little less certain for you. What historians really do is that's the title of my lecture, they tell stories about the past. That's all they really do. They tell stories. History is about telling a good story. So this is something in our public discourse today that you hear all the time. People say, the facts are on my side, the facts are on my side. And what does that mean? Facts are infinite. Data is infinite. Facts are infinite. We all choose the facts we like. And in history, it's like that too. History is full of stories. Some of them are really boring. And a historian doesn't write about the boring ones. There might be things in the archive that you could write about, but you reject those because they're not interesting. And so what we would like to do is tell you a good story that you're going to like and will be meaningful to you. Now, there's a lot of boring history books. That's true, but, down deep inside, most of us, myself included, would love to write a history book that's a New York Times bestseller. So we want to tell you a good story. And so anyway, you see right there what we have. That is not any kind of objective reporting of the facts. That's me saying, I want to tell this story, but this story is unimportant. This story, I'll let that be lost to humanity. I won't tell that one. I'll tell this one because this one's important to me and also hopefully to you. That's a subjective decision right from the very beginning. That's just a choice. We choose the story. We choose the facts. We choose the stories that we think are important to us and will be as meaningful as possible to as many people as possible. People say that the first historian, they call him the father of history, is this Greek writer Herodotus. And he wrote a book called The Persian Wars. He didn't write a book about the boring daily life of peasants raising their sheep in the countryside who experienced absolutely nothing of interest. No, he wrote the story of the grand and magnificent story of the Persian Wars. Well, I'm not going to talk in detail right now about Herodotus and the Persian Wars, but the map kind of helps you see why it's a good story. Look at Persia on the map. It's a massive, highly developed empire with roads and coins and a uniting language and a single unified state, basically under an emperor, and it's divided up into provinces, and it's rich, and it has a massive army. And look at Greece. It's just here on this one, in this one little corner of the map. It's a mountainous, impoverished, politically divided land that they're not even united. They live in independent city-states, and they're tiny and insignificant compared to the great empire of Persia. And then the Persians decide to attack the Greeks, and the Greeks are disunited, and they fight with each other half the time. But Herodotus tells this story of the little impoverished, disunited Greeks suddenly get this shot of courage and bravery and decide to fight for their culture and independence, and they withstand 2 attacks from the Persians, the mighty Persian army. The Persians throw all their resources at the little disunited Greeks, and the Greeks survive. And wow, that's a great story. That kind of underdog story recurs over and over again in Western culture and Western history. We love that kind of story. And of course, that's why Herodotus told us that story instead of about some boring sheep farmers on the hillside. That nobody's interested in that. You could tell either story, maybe, and by the way, maybe some modern economic historians, maybe they'd be more interested in the boring story of the shepherds on the hillside. But that's not a New York Times bestseller. The Persian Wars is. And so historians we're storytellers. We tell stories about the past. Now, maybe I'm making you a little nervous here because you're thinking, well, is the historian just a novelist? Does a historian just go down in the cellar and make up some characters and some stories? Well, maybe sometimes, but I hope not. That's not what they're supposed to do. Historians tell stories, and they try to tell good stories and meaningful stories. But let's say this, they play by different rules than the novelist or the fiction writer or the science fiction writer. Historians have to play by a different set of rules. You tell a story about the past, but to do it, you have to use sources. And most importantly, you have to use what are called primary sources. And here's where, as I tell you what a historian does, I hope you'll see how unclear the facts really are. I hope you'll see that as we go along. So to repeat myself, history, it's not an objective report of all the facts that happened in the past. Don't ever think of it that way. It's historians choosing to tell stories that they try to piece together like a puzzle based on the primary sources that they have. And with the primary sources come a lot of problems. First of all, let's clarify what a primary source is. It could be a complicated discussion, but for our purposes, it's pretty simple. Primary source is a source written in the time that you are studying, right? It's a source written in the time that you are studying. So very simply, if you're studying World War I occurred between 1914 and 1918. So you must study primary sources from that period, 1914 to 1918. Not what somebody said later, but what somebody said in that period. That's crucial to understand, and a lot of people don't know that. That's what a primary source is. History cannot be done without primary sources. And in the Renaissance, they had this Latin phrase, ad fontes, to the sources. And they were very strict about it in the Renaissance, and we should be still today, that to answer any historical question, you must go to the primary sources. That's going to be really difficult. It takes time, it takes probably some funding, it takes skills. usually it brings you to an archive, and you get, here's some things that I pulled up from my work in the archive, just so you can see a lot of times it's manuscripts. Now, I want you to understand this point about ad fontes. All, and you need to know this before you take one more step in the historical discipline, all historical questions must be resolved in the primary sources. All historical questions must be resolved in primary sources. A lot of people, when they talk about history, they talk about their theories about history. I have maybe two examples I can give you. One, I'm fascinated with what they call the early modern period in 1500s, 1600s, and I'm fascinated with supernatural beliefs that people had. So probably everybody in Europe, for example, in the 1500s believed in witches and astrology and magic, and that fascinates me. And why? And that's a really complicated question. Now, a lot of people would say the reason they believed in the supernatural is because of the power of the Roman Catholic Church that stifled all opposition and other views and brainwashed people to believe in supernatural. That's a really good theory. And I suspect that there's some truth to it. I also think it's a little bit like a cliche. But you know what? The theory and what I think about it mean absolutely nothing. If that's your theory about why people believed in the supernatural, you have to go look at some old documents that look like these, or actually they'll be a lot harder and they'll be in Latin or some really complicated dialect. You have to go and show that in the primary sources. You have to produce the evidence. And you would be surprised how difficult. There's so many things that people think about history and they think, oh, that's just common sense. You would be surprised how difficult it is actually to show it. It might make perfect sense to you. You'd be surprised how hard it is to demonstrate it, use it playing by the rules of the historian. We don't just make things up like a novelist. Let me give you the other example that comes up when I teach United States history. What were the motivations? Why did the United States drop the atomic bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 at the end of World War II? My answer would be to end the war, but some of my students, a lot of them come from Eastern Europe, would say, well, look at the situation. The United States wanted to intimidate the Soviet Union. It wanted to show the Soviet Union that it had this powerful weapon. That's a good theory. I suspect there may be some partial truth to it. And it makes sense to us. It seems logical. And according to us, that's how people think. But once again, what we think, both the theory and what we think about it, whether it makes sense or not, are entirely irrelevant. If that's your theory about why the United States dropped the atomic bombs, then you need to get into the primary sources and show it. Just the fact that it makes sense to you today doesn't really mean anything, because historians tell stories, yes, but they also play by rules, and you have to find evidence in the primary sources. There's no way around that. Now that we know that, once you start looking at the primary sources, there's all kinds of problems. So one problem, if you study ancient history, is there's too little. There's not enough material. So take the New Testament, right? In the New Testament, there's the letters from Paul of Tarsus to the Romans and the Ephesians and the Corinthians. I wonder if those are the only letters that Paul wrote. It seems kind of strange. Those are the ones that got picked for the Bible, but did he write some others? And if he did, what did they say? No, we don't know. It's a hypothetical, but you see what I'm saying? There's so many things in the ancient world that we wish we could see. I'll leave that. My specialty is modern history. So you get the printing press in around 1450, and then there's cheap paper, and The printing press is a technological explosion, kind of like the computer today. So what I'm getting at is suddenly there's lots of material, even in the 1500s, but then press that forward to the modern machine printing press and newspapers, and then all the way to the digital age. So here's my problem. Here's the problem with modern history. There's too many sources, and this is very troubling, because I know any historian who's honest with you will tell you, sitting in most modern archives, that there are maybe millions of documents that probably nobody will ever look at. And that's just because there's too many. And so let me add to your uncertainty a little more too. When a historian goes to the archive, so you have 3 weeks in the archive, and there's just an infinite amount of material there. And so you write down your priorities before you go, and you go to the archive and you look at this, but not this, but look, you never read all the evidence. You never read all the data. And so human beings have this dangerous and strange ability to have theories and then find evidence to prove their theories without looking at contrary evidence. They call this, I think today, confirmation bias. So you go into the archive, looking to validate a theory that you had before you went in, and you go there and you find all the evidence that supports your theory. What a surprise. Well, you had all these biases going in the first place, and that happens. Now, I want to say this, and I'll pick up at the end of the lecture. I'll say more about this. I do think there's some correctives. There are historians that will admit to you that there were surprises. Sometimes it's great. You can read a history book, and the historian will say, I went into the archive expecting this, but I found the opposite. And that's really interesting. I've had a few surprises in the archive. And the second corrective is this too. There are other historians, at least in an open and free society, and they challenge what you found in the archive and they go looking for other things, or sometimes they read the same sources and get different conclusions. But let's move on, because now we're talking about evaluating sources. You can't just, well, look, you all know this. People lie. So you have to evaluate the sources. You can't just go in and believe everything you read. Just because it's in an old document doesn't mean it's true. People lie, but it's much more complicated than that. They don't just lie, they exaggerate, or in their head, they think they're telling the truth, but they're lying to themselves. And so they're telling the truth, but they're really lying. And then sources contradict each other. Even individuals contradict each other, sometimes some more than others. And so what do you do with sources that contradict each other? How do you decide which one is true? And it's not just true or false. There's levels of credibility. And then historians look at the same source and come to radically different conclusions. You see how untenable your list of agreed upon facts is. History is not a list of facts. It's a complicated effort by historians to tell stories based on primary sources that are really hard to understand. And understanding the sources is difficult too. Right away, you run into language, and there's a myriad of problems. I mean, if you study ancient history, some of the languages are dead and nobody speaks them anymore. It's almost impossible to know what people were saying. Even more recently, just within the last couple hundred years, languages have evolved considerably, and there's dialects. So it might be even your native language, and it might be hard to understand. There's just these documents that I'm showing you here are very nicely written. Somebody took time to write them nicely. This one's a copy, so maybe they copied it by hand. Sometimes manuscripts are almost impossible to decipher. The handwriting so difficult that, I personally can tell you I've spent hours sometimes trying to figure out a manuscript, sometimes even days maybe. And here's another scary thing. Sometimes I'll just move on because my life is finite. I don't have time to So maybe I skipped the document because I couldn't read it, and maybe there's something really, really important in there, and I'd have to write my article differently if I really knew what was in that document, but I couldn't read it. There are huge cultural differences. This is a letter to President Roosevelt in the 1930s, but even in the 1930s, people referred to things that we don't know what they are, or they're maybe we do, but they're very rare today. And even my generation, we can reference things that a lot of younger people probably don't know about. I mean, how many of you out there under 30 know what the yellow pages were? So understanding sources on many levels, language, handwriting, cultural differences. Oh, and the final thing, just the ambiguity of the human mind. I mean, I'm sure you've gotten emails from people and it's in your own language and it's grammatically correct, but you just cannot understand what that email is saying, as it's ambiguous, and sometimes people just can't write well. So it's hard enough to understand contemporaries when they write an email, for example. Imagine trying to understand somebody from 3,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago, or even sometimes 500 years ago. It's hard to understand. It's just the ambiguity of the human mind sometimes. So anyway, I hope you start to see, as you start to understand what historians do, I hope you can see history is not just a list of agreed upon facts. Now, secondary sources. But let me just reemphasize, the gold standard for historical research is primary sources, and that's why I spent so much time on the primary sources. And remember this, all historical questions must be resolved in the primary sources. End of story. That's the game, that's the rules by which historians tell their stories. Now, secondary sources. Secondary sources are professional historians, well, maybe not always, but historians, telling their stories based on what they have of the primary sources. So doing all the things that I just told you about, then they try to take all those primary sources and make sense of them and put them together in a story. Those are history books, history articles, textbooks, which I'll get to in a minute. So they're modern historians basically trying to put together the primary sources to tell a story. They are not the final source of authority. That's, remember, the primary sources. It's in essence, I mean, it's just what smart people think about the primary sources. If you're a professional historian, you need to know the secondary literature. You can't make your core arguments based on the secondary sources. They're not the gold standard. So secondary sources are scholars telling stories based on the primary sources. Many history books are, in fact, very boring. I don't think that's the ideal, though. Some are excellent. I like a lot of, it's easier to write about modern history. The great military historian Anthony Beevor, The Fall of Berlin, it's published by Penguin. It's a good read. Very profound and sad. Timothy Snyder, Bloodlands. Right, it's about Eastern Central Europe in World War II. Beautiful history. These are good historians. I live in the Czech Republic. There's a very good Battle for the Castle by Andrea Orzov about a revisionist history of Czechoslovakia in the interwar period. Excellent book. Very good books. You should not be afraid of them, but also they're not the ultimate answer. They're just what historians say about the primary sources. And I need to get this point across before I move on. You need to know this. Professional historians disagree with each other. The experts disagree. I know this just blows people away. We live in this age where simple-minded people are constantly telling us, believe the experts, believe the experts. And I am an expert. We need experts, but we need experts because we don't have the answers, and the world is unclear, and they disagree with each other. And I think that's true in every discipline. And so that's an important indication to you that, look, history is not just a list of agreed upon facts. You would actually be surprised how many things that the general public takes for granted in history, but expert historians will say, no, it's more complicated than you think. Anyway, then the textbooks and also university classes like the ones that I teach. So it's interesting to me, there's this irony about textbooks and also classes and their professors. A lot of people out in the general public, civilians, think that textbooks and university classes are the authority where you get the answers, especially with textbooks. They think it's the place, you're in an argument about something in history with a friend, and people think the place to go to get the answer is the textbook or the professor maybe. And the irony is that's exactly the opposite of what those things are. A textbook is never the end of the quest. It's the beginning. Textbook is for teaching. So think about this. When we teach children the colors, we don't start with the difficult ones. Aqua green, emerald green. We don't start with all the complicated shades of green. No, you start with primary colors. This is green, this is blue, this is yellow, this is red. You know what I'm saying? We make something that's really complicated super simple, 5-6 colors, and that's what you learn when you're a 5-year-old, 4-year-old. And then you get more complicated. That's what textbooks do for us, right? They take something that's very complicated and they lay it out for us in a way that we can understand. So you can imagine there's a lot of subjective decision making. Textbooks are absolutely not authoritative, objective accounts of history. They're usually written by experts, which is good. And they're experts that want to tell you what they think are the most important things in their field. Textbooks are more about secondary literature than they are about the primary sources, and they're just telling you, giving you a summary of what's important in their field at the time. There's so many subjective decisions that go into textbooks. Say you have 1,000 pages for your textbook, but you have 2,000 pages of material that you think is really important. Well, you have to cut something out. Once again, there's a subjective decision. You choose some stories that you think are important and you cut out others. Different societies do this in different ways. In the United States, where I grew up, it's pretty famous. High school textbooks, a lot of times the public plays a role in deciding. People make fun of that. But I promise you, in every community, somebody makes a subjective decision about what is good for the students to read about history and what is not good. I promise you, everywhere where they have official textbooks and school systems adopt them, somebody somewhere makes a subjective decision, and that's always arguable, and they decide, hey, this should go in the book, this shouldn't go in the book, because this is a good story and this isn't. This is an important story and this one isn't. This is a moral story and this one isn't. Anyway, I've probably gone on too long about textbooks. And university classes, the same thing. The classes that I offer you an introduction to a lot of subjects that they're not my specialty. I'm a professionally trained historian, and I think I can be a useful guide. But here's the thing, textbooks, university classes, And by the way, I don't even think we need textbooks anymore because the internet, you can Google things and it's the same thing. Sorry if I offend anybody. I think it's kind of snobbish to ignore the fact that you can just type something in Google and do a huge preliminary research, because that's only the beginning. It's not the end. You won't answer any big questions. You're just getting information so you can begin the process. So textbooks are the beginning, not the end. They're the entryway, right? They're not where you get the answers. Here's a nice one. Western civilization. And look at, maybe you can see here, suggested reading. Look at all those books you can read to start to get to the answers. Textbook just introduces you. It tells you where to go next. And I think it's a horrible mistake that we constantly make you buy expensive new editions, as, by the way, the facts of history change every couple of years. I don't think that's really necessary, partly because of the internet and partly because, old textbooks are sometimes really spectacular, maybe better than new textbooks. I love this one, 1971. I love this book, The Norton History of Modern Europe. Maybe here's a look at all my underlining, and I write in the columns. And, it's very different from this one. I think both are good, but I probably would say I like this one better. Look at that beautiful old book. But, sometimes when I need to find out something, I just Google it too. Because the reason is I'm not looking for an authoritative answer. I'm looking at where to start. And so when you think about history, remember, if you really want to settle a historical question or come close, you go to the primary sources. As you approach the primary sources, you start with some textbooks, you go to secondary sources, and you eventually, if you really follow your question bravely, you'll go to the archive. Anyway, I need to wind this up. Let's go back. I said my aim today is to disabuse you of the terrible misconception that history is a catalog of agreed upon facts that you can haul out anytime because they're certainly true and you can use them to win historical arguments. And so I think the conclusion from that is that, that interpretation matters. All history comes with an interpretation. Every historian approaches history in a different way. And that bias, and people don't like it when there's bias in history, but there's always bias in history. All kinds of things influence the way you look at the sources and interpret them. And interpretation is really important. And people are kind of being irresponsible by ignoring it. People would rather just pretend that it's easy. It's just the facts. I just have to learn what the names of the kings and when they were born and when they died, and I know history. People would prefer to think like that, but and try to ignore the fact that there is no history without interpretation. Historians tell a story, and they try to tell a story that's important to them and that they think will be meaningful to as many other people as possible. If you don't think interpretation matters, think about this. So maybe you're taking notes and you wrote the date, and I don't want to say the real date because maybe I'll use this lecture in the future. Let's say it's 2020. And you wrote the year 2020 at the top of the paper. Why is it 2020? Come on, have you ever thought about that? Well, because it's 2020 years since Jesus was born. And that is a Christian interpretation of history. Now, a lot of my students aren't Christians. Why do you accept a Christian view of history? Do you believe in Jesus? Do you think he was born in the year 0? Do you think he should be the center of all human timekeeping? Well, I know people think, well, that's not a big deal, but I'm trying to show you actually, it has been a big deal to a lot of people. A lot of people don't like the idea that we have to use Christian timekeeping. Muslims, obviously, I have a lot of Muslim students. The Hijra, right, is year 1, but in Western civilization, many people have rejected the idea that Jesus should be the center of human history. The French Revolution, 1792, they overthrew the old regime and killed the king and wrote a new constitution. And part of what they were deliberately saying is, we want to get a lot of the Christian influence out. And so 1792, the year of the new republic, is now year one. And they tried to use that system, year one. And the reason is explicitly because of historical interpretation. They wanted to say, no, the French Republic is the most important thing in human history, not the birth of Jesus. The Bolsheviks in 1917 tried to do the same thing, and it's hard to do because people are attached to the Christian system. The Bolsheviks tried to do the same thing, less successfully. And then in 1975, it's another example that I know about specifically, the Khmer Rouge declared 1975 when they attacked the capital and overthrew the old system and ushered in the age of communism. 1975 was year one. And in fact, not just with the Khmer Rouge, but among the Southeast Asian communist parties, there was a big argument over what should be year one, and people actually got killed. And so my point is, you think it doesn't matter that you write 2020 on your paper, but the Christians succeeded in a way in forcing their view of history upon all of us. And some people over time have been very sensitive about that. In the United States, in the 1990s, they tried to change BC and AD, like 500 BC, right, before Christ, Anno Domini, basically after the life of Christ. They tried to change those to BCE, before Common Era, to the ideas like not just Christians, but others, and CE, Common Era. And you might see that in some textbooks. I don't know if they still do that, by the way. I've lived in Europe for a long time now, but I don't know if they're still doing that. I kind of supported it. Like I said, probably most of my students aren't Christians, and why should we force Christian priorities in history on everybody? However, I'm not fanatic about it. I went back to BC and AD because what counts is the numbers, right? If you write 2020, you're saying it's 2020 years since Christ. What does it really matter if you write CE instead of AD? You're still basically acknowledging the Christian chronology. And my only point here is, people want to pretend that there's no subjective interpretation in history, that it's just a list of easy facts. And they want to do that because it helps them to avoid thinking about more complicated things, like the fact that there always is interpretation. There's no escaping it. It's all around us. It's very influential, and people do fight over it and literally die over it sometimes. Anyway, I want to finish this lecture up. I try to do it in 50 minutes. Might be a little bit over this time, but I'm almost done. Oh, and I want to say one more thing. In part 2 of this lecture, I will talk about some influential interpretations. So tune into part 2. History is a cycle. History is the story of human progress. History is the story of the nation. History is the story of economic classes. Part 2. But let's finish up here. So what I'm telling you makes people nervous. I've hinted several times, people are much more comfortable with history as facts. It's comforting. It gives us a sense of certainty, and we feel good about that. And when someone like me, people feel uncomfortable when historians come along and challenge the comforting narrative of the past, change the story. People see it as changing history. In the United States, it would be easier just to think of Thomas Jefferson as the guy who said all men are created equal, but not to think about maybe he had some racist beliefs. I live in the Czech Republic. It's much nicer to think of interwar Czechoslovakia as the harmless democracy that was just destroyed by the Nazis, and instead of to be critical of the First Republic of Czechoslovakia. People feel really uncomfortable with that. In Russia, it's much easier just to think of World War II as the Great Patriotic War and not to think about the horrible atrocities committed in the Soviet Union that maybe are worse than the Nazi atrocities, or to think about the fact that maybe there was racism and anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union. Maybe we know there was. People would prefer that historians just leave the comfortable narratives alone. World War II is, for a lot of people, untouchable. They'd rather just not confront historians on that issue. As I'll try to say at the end here, I think authoritarian, totalitarian governments, they were very concerned with history and telling the right version of history. And so why is that, and how can we deal with both that need for a certain narrative and also the need for critical scholarship in history? How can we put those two things together? So I've thought carefully about this. I really like, I'm a fan of Václav Havel, the first president of Czechoslovakia, and an incredibly insightful dissident during the communist regime of Czechoslovakia. And he wrote this spectacular essay, The Power of the Powerless. And there's so much to say about the power of the powerless, but one of the things he's thinking about is totalitarianism, the regime that he lives under, and why is it like that? And one of the things that he postulates is that human beings need certainty, or maybe we long for certainty. We long for certainty. And I think that's maybe an insightful observation. Maybe Havel was right about that. And I'm not going to say that's a bad thing. In some ways, it's good because we want to know. And so that drives us to do research, which in turn destroys our certainty. But it's not necessarily a bad thing. But the question is, what do we do with that longing for certainty? And how do we harmonize that with the need for critical research, which changes history? How do we do that? And so this is the best I can come up with. I think I'll just tell you right away. I think the best thing we have going for us is what Karl Popper called the open society. He wrote this great book called The Open Society and Its Enemies. And I think that's the best we can do in this problem. It's a great book too, by the way. Not a history book, but very relevant to history. Anyway, so I think if you think about human governments, this is a sliding scale. That's why I put the arrows in there. And so it's not so simple like open societies and authoritarian societies. There's lots of levels along the way. It's a spectrum. So I think the best we can do is what Karl Popper called the open society. Now, and in the open society, I remember when I was talking about confirmation bias, this is how it works. One historian goes into the archive and tells his or her story and publishes his or her book, and another historian comes along and says, no, that's all wrong, and reviews it and goes into the archive and finds something else. And that's a great process. That's the scholarly process. That's what, peer review is kind of a cliche. I mean, the peers might all be a bunch of compromised hacks, who knows, but on the other hand, it does mean something, right? That's the idea that in a free, open society, anybody can test anybody else's work. Now, even in open societies, I agree with Havel, we do have a longing for certainty, and we do set up our own, even in free societies, we do set up a kind of elite, and this is true in history too, where we kind of trust people who are at Oxford or Harvard, and they have some amount of power, economic and social power, and so people tend to believe their books and they have more access to publishers and all of that. And that does trouble me a little bit, because really an argument is true or false or valid or invalid on its own, regardless of who's making it. But on the other hand, I understand it. It's okay to have elite institutions. Being elite doesn't mean they're right, but it's okay to have them because we have this longing for certainty. So, okay. But the thing is, in an open society, there's always the possibility for challenge. There's still critical research. There's self-reflection. You can criticize the popular narrative. It might be hard because if you're not in a powerful position, it's hard to get people to listen to you. But it can be done. And I would say even in open societies, a lot of us kind of like the little guy. We kind of like to see the unknown YouTuber challenge the Harvard professor. And that's good. Most of the times the Harvard professor wins. A lot of times that person has the preparation, but also the financial resources and all of that. But there's challengers, and that there's dangerous challengers out there to the historical narrative. And there's always competing historical interpretations, and that creates uncertainty, a level of uncertainty. So I think in the open society, we've worked out a good balance where we kind of have some certainty, like if you're really boring, you can only read histories from elite institutions, but we also have dangerous challengers who sometimes come out of nowhere, and their arguments and their rhetoric is so compelling that people listen, and they can overthrow the dominant historical narrative. And I think that's a great thing. Now, I've noticed something you hear a lot today about, especially it's politicians talking about controlling the narrative, and that's very relevant to what I'm talking about today, because history is a narrative, it's a story. And so I understand why people talk about that, and it's complicated, but I do think once you start using that language and doing it, then you're going this way. My personal feeling is that in the Western world, we are in, I sometimes call it an authoritarian moment. I think there's a deep longing for certainty. And there's a lot of people that would say, not just about history, but a lot of things, they would just say, I don't want questions. I don't want real research. I just want answers. I want authoritarian answers. And I think we've been in this place before. I think that's partly what happened in the 19th century and in the interwar period. And the trend is toward more authoritarian societies, I think. But instead of speculating about the future, I'll just talk about the past. In authoritarian societies, particularly the totalitarian governments in the 20th century, history was really important. And not only that, but they provided, as Havel said, deep certainty about history and everything else. And the way you do that, the way you nourish that longing for certainty, is you just appoint a panel of experts. And some of them are very, very smart. And they probably go through a lot to get their qualifications, and they're in elite institutions, and they kind of look like our elite over here in the free society or open society. But there's an important difference in an authoritarian society. The elite experts also have political power. They're wedded to political power. And when you have that in a totalitarian society, I think that's really dangerous for history and, by implication, all other scholarship, by the way. And the reason is this. When you hand over the historical narrative to elite experts who get to decide what's true, and you also give them political power, think about this. Theoretically, they will always be right. No, not just theoretically, practically. They'll just always be right. They'll never be wrong. I know you think, what is he saying? Well, I think this happened. Mao Zedong was never wrong. He killed 40 million people in a famine, but Joseph Stalin was never wrong. Well, that's because they did this. They had lots of experts who were very smart people, and they also had political power, and they all built their own stories of history and other things too. But they didn't have this. If you tried to challenge the Soviet narrative, they just shut you down. You couldn't work as a historian, or you had to do some other job, or in the worst days, they put you in a gulag. And if you really seriously challenged the historical narrative, they could kill you. I mean, literally, there are some theorists that would say that's what totalitarianism is. That's what gulags and death camps were. They were actually totalitarian regimes obliterating contrary data, getting rid of all the evidence that suggests that they're wrong. And so they're really, look at totalitarian leaders and governments. They're always right. They're never wrong. And that's easy because there's nobody there to tell them they're wrong, because they eliminate all of them. And so that can happen with history, and has. And I want to close with that, because I want people to think about that. The belief that history is just a settled list of facts. I want you to think, the reason I'm telling you about totalitarianism and all of that is because I want you to think about where that belief ultimately leads. The belief that knowledge is settled fact, and that it's simple just to appeal to experts to get the answers, and there should be no revision or discussion about it. That's how people think of history. So I want you to think about, if you follow that idea to its logical conclusion, where do you go? And I want you to think about that. And then I want you to think about what that really does to scholarship. I mean, it might be nice to live in a closed little circle where you're always right, but of course we know you're not really always right. And not only that, but I think all the disciplines, but particularly history was important in totalitarian regimes. You absolutely destroy history. Now, really, it's like learning history is really like being a fundamentalist Christian and learning Bible verses. All you have to do is memorize and cite the latest approved studies. And so I think a lot of students, particularly the ones that come from Eastern Europe, from the legacy of totalitarianism, think history is boring. And I understand why. It is really boring if it's all settled and there's no more questions. Like, there's no food for the human soul in that. You just memorize and read the approved narratives, and there's nothing to challenge or question. And of course, that's not interesting. And I hope we don't want to live in a world like that. And as a historian, I see it as my personal responsibility to try to argue against that. I will caution you, a lot of people like that. That's the orthodoxy of totalitarianism and authoritarianism. Sadly, a lot of people would prefer, this is why people get upset at historians who are so-called revisionists and change history. This is why people get all upset, because they would prefer history just to be settled by experts and unquestioned and unchangeable. Maybe there's nothing wrong with the longing for certainty. That might be just part of being human. The problem is when we cheat and we buy our certainty cheaply without going through the rigorous process of questioning and investigation that we have to go to. Well, so I'll conclude, I hope, and please tune in to the second lecture where I'll talk about historical interpretations. Sorry, I took a little longer than I expected. I'll close by reminding you, please don't come to my classes thinking of history as a list of easily agreed upon facts about which there can be no debate. Remember, history is nothing more than stories about the past told by historians the best they can, based on their ability to reconstruct the absolutely uncertain and hard to understand primary sources. I'll close with that. Thank you for your attention. Goodbye.